Thank you, Tom. That was very educational and entertaining. Our next speaker is Kat Slaughter. Kat has been museum director for the Historical Society of Pottawattamie County for 5 years. She studied at the University of Wyoming, graduating in 2016 with a bachelor's degree of history and anthropology with an emphasis in museum studies. Kat's main duties are caring for both the Squirrel Cage Jail and RailsWest Railroad Museum, that's a mouthful, for the Historical Society. During the past 5 years, Kat, and the board have been hard at work preserving both museums, cataloging artifacts, research, adding new displays, and bringing the attention of the museums to more people, including an international audience. Recently, Kat and the board of the society have been working with the Iowa Sheriff and Deputies Association in their new partnership. So here she is, Kat.
Hey, like she said, I am the museum director for the Historical Society, and today I'm going to talk about the Squirrel Cage Jail. It was built in 1885. Let's see if I know how to work this. All right, 1885, and served the county up until 1969 as the county jail. A total of 84 years. Now, why is this jail exciting or historically interesting? It's a jail, right? But it's also a Rotary jail or a Lazy Susan style jail. So that means this style was designed and later patented by William Brown and Benjamin Ha. They even had designs using a prison style with rotary cages basically at the end of each row. Their patent for that can be found online, and I highly recommend taking a look. But the cage had 3 levels. There are 10 cells per floor for a capacity of 60 inmates. There'd be 2 inmates per cell. When I say the inmates in there, it's just going to be men, and those are going to be ages 14 years and up. So a little different than what we think of being in a jail for Maine Pop today. Now, we are lucky to have some blueprints that I'm skipping to, and these were drawn up in 1957. So in this diagram, you can see the 3 levels of cells on the left side, that central column, and they're going to be just 1 entry point at each front level. And the close-up of the cells is going to show the 2 bunks with small alcove at the back, which I will describe in more detail, but I don't want to give any spoilers quite yet. But the other portion on the right side is going to show the first floor and exterior of the cell block. That's also known as the bullpen. And if the inmates are well behaved, they can spend time outside their tiny cells in that first floor area and get some fresh air and light. Because until 1960, those cells did not have electric lighting. They were completely just reliant on that outside source of light. Now, the idea of the Rotary Jail is to have little to no interactions with the inmates. They'll have little interaction with each other if they're not behaved. And the jailer and his wife will have very little interaction with them as well. It's a cheap facility to build in that it was $30,000 back in 1885. With inflation, we're looking at a little over $800,000 today, but it has been standing for a little over 135 years. So not a horrible investment. And it had that very small staff of just the jailer and wife, which is, again, that's a pretty cheap staff to pay for. Now, there were quite a few Rotary jails. There were actually 18 built in between 1881 and 1888. They spread fairly quickly in that 7-year period, but only 3 of those remain today. Thankfully, all 3 of us are museums. There's one in Gallatin, Missouri, which is a 1-story. There's a 2-story in Crawfordsville, Indiana, which still rotates, so highly recommend a road trip. And then, of course, ours here in Council Bluffs, which we're very lucky, is the largest one ever constructed at 3 stories of rotary cells. Now, most of these were in the Midwest, but they do spread to the Upper East Coast. And so on this slide, you can see a portion of the ones that were built. The ones in bold are the ones that still stand. And then you'll see a few more on this one. Now, many were demolished fairly quickly because these were better in theory than they were in practice. And this map will show that spread where they do end up in that Upper East area. So if you guys want to take a quick look at that, you can see they're mostly centered here in the Midwest states, but we do have a few outliers. But we have quite a few jail records over the years, opening in 1885 and serving, like I said, up till 1969, just a mere 52 years ago. And so all inmates would start their stay at the booking office where all their personal belongings are taken away. You get to keep your matches and cigarettes because that's very important, as well as a comb on your person. Now, while in the booking office, their information is put into our records. In the earlier years, we have a name and a number. By the time we hit the late 30s and 40s, we start seeing information that is more interesting to us today. We're going to see, like on this slide from 1934, the date and time of their intake, the name of the inmate, sentencing date, as well as their charge, the days or months their sentence, the date and time of their release, and the officer or judge that is in charge of that release. In some of our other records, we can also see whether they're being transferred to Anamosa, Fort Madison, so you can really see the start of their journey. And I'm actually in the process of creating a database of all of our jailers' records in hopes to have a searchable database of all of our inmates and hopefully to run some demographics of the types of crimes that we were having, the lengths of their sentences, how many men and women were housed at the jail over the years. So far, I'm through 1933 to 1947, so it's an ongoing process. And this is an example of one of our fingerprint cards because intake process really hasn't changed. Fingerprinting started about 20 years after the jail opened. It's a relatively new thing to us at any rate. It started about 1905. Now we have records from at least 1920 up until 1969. And we just received a donation of a filing cabinet that's larger than me, full of fingerprint cards. So we're working on going through those. The Sheriff's Department graciously donated those to us. We are also working on digitizing those, and during that process, we've learned quite a bit about our inmates. One that stands out to me is of a 12-year-old boy. We have his fingerprint card. He was sentenced at the jail. He was shooting chickens in the 1920s, and he is sent to a reform school directly from our facility. So it's a little bit different. It was kind of shocking to see a 12-year-old boy's fingerprints and that he was housed at a county jail. These cards really do tell us a lot of information. We're able to learn more of the stories of the people that were housed within our walls. They tell us about where they lived, the time that they spent, their occupation, descriptions, and of course the charge, which are kind of unusual. Between the jail records and fingerprint cards, we have learned that people were housed at the squirrel cage for all sorts of crimes, such as passing on the wrong side of the road, speeding, fishing without a license will get you 5 nights at the county jail. And of course, the violent crimes. Now, these violent crimes are felony level crimes. You're only going to be there for your trial time. So we're kind of a way station, if you will. Most of the time, it's going to be a short period, but if you're there for your trial, you're going somewhere else. Inmates could also be housed as lodging in order to move them from one area to another, because it took a little longer to get across the state when we opened up. Now, inmates weren't always so happy to end up at the squirrel cage for some reason. So if they were causing trouble during that booking process, they're going to hit solitary confinement, which you can see in this picture. It is just the little box in between the metal door and bars. It's about 6 feet tall, 2 feet deep, and about 2 feet wide if we're being nice here with those measurements. Most grown men aren't able to move in there, let alone stand tall. This was meant to be used for just 30 minutes to a couple of hours until the inmate calms themselves down, but we are aware of an inmate who spent 10 days in solitary confinement. He actually is in Fort Madison today, but he would have received bread and water twice a day and a coffee can or bucket at his feet for his toilet. So now these are the cells. And this is going to be the next part of the inmate's journey. Hopefully they just go straight from the booking office to here and can skip solitary confinement. But the first picture on the left is that alcove I mentioned briefly. That is the toilet in the cell. So in the back of each cell, they do have running water that would remove the waste. It's going to have kind of a gravity flow system and remove it to one central pipe in the base. Now, the only ventilation for these toilets is small holes on that curved portion on top of it. The middle picture is going to show how the cells are completely closed off. There are no separate doors, only bars. So that's why you have to rotate it around to let inmates in or out of the entire structure. And the final photo shows one of the openings, as well as the materials inmates may have in their cell, which can be different depending on the year. And now, we did take away their shoelaces at the beginning of their journey, but depending on that year again, you could have a laundry line in your cell, because that's going to be just fine, right? Some of the logic there, it's fun. But they had very little to entertain themselves. So while you're bored as an inmate, you have matches and you have some paper. So you're gonna roll up a piece of paper, light it on fire, and write all over the walls and ceiling. Basically the underside of any bunk. They could also use coal dust in the early years because the jail had no heat, only coals heated up in the kitchen for the first 20 years of our life. Now, you can see this writing basically anywhere in the jail. But they couldn't just stop there. So we have more kinds of graffiti. And this is all carved into the walls, or even on the right side of that image is going to be our picnic table, and they carved in with spoons. Now, we have some benches in there that are reproductions, and we thought they looked too nice and shiny, so we'll carve into them as well, make it look a little bit better. We had screwdrivers. It took us forever, and I could never manage to get Donald Duck to look like that, let alone the letter S. They also even carved into the cement floor, so they had time and patience that I will never find. I mentioned that 12-year-old. Child services does not start until the 1960s, which means our juvie could hold kids anywhere from the age of 3 to 13. Doesn't mean the kid did anything wrong, but their parents or guardians may have been in trouble and are being housed at the jail, and there's nowhere else for that child to go. Now, they could also be in there for being out past curfew or runaways until their parents come and collect them. Or maybe they're having some underage beer. That did happen on occasion. Now, all these inmates are going to need to be fed, which means the jailer needs to have a sister or a wife because a cook is required. So she gets to do all of the cooking, and she is known as the jail matron. She is cooking on that cast iron stove, which is the original stove at the jail, and she'll be cooking up to 90 meals per mealtime if the jail is at capacity. It's not until 1920 that a summer kitchen is built, and that's going to be on the lower right, left hand, I know my directions, of this slide. And that makes it a little bit easier to prepare the massive quantities of food. We have some pictures of the inside, and they actually have a nice range that you can work on and a large sink, because we didn't get a sink in there, or the proper one that you see, even until around 1920. Now, this room, as many others, have multi-purpose. So this is also the dining room for the jailer and his family, because the jailer and family will live on site, and so many rooms are used for multiple things. All right, so maybe you have a virus. You've broken your arm, you're going to end up in the infirmary. Having this many people close together is going to cause viruses to go right through it, as we've learned this year. Inmates did also tend to stick their arms and legs out as the cage rotated. This was to try and escape, because earlier you might get to go straight to the hospital for that kind of injury. Now instead you're going out to the infirmary. So there were quite a few blunt force trauma accidents and also purposeful accidents at the cage. Now, if they are bad enough, they will still be transferred to the hospital. But if they're staying in our infirmary, a doctor is on call who will come tend to those injuries when they're available. Now, something interesting about this room is during the summer months, it's also used as a punishment room. There's little to no airflow in there. In this summer, we've barely been below 90 degrees in there today. And we have the room vented and open, things that they wouldn't have had the opportunity to do. Now, the smells from the toilet system, they have to go somewhere. This is usually everyone's favorite question of how bad did the jail smell? Very bad. They got to shower once a week by the 1930s when we had proper plumbing. They're going to shower in their clothes because there's no other form of laundry. They're allowed to smoke basically as much as they want, and the toilet system. So what we're looking into here is the 4th floor. The first picture is looking up in that little chamber, because that is the trap door that they would use to vent. Because when we look kind of directly in that middle picture, that is the top of the cage. So if we were to look down in that section, we would see small holes with light. And those are the ventilation holes from those toilets, which means heat rises. And it's going to go up and hopefully out. There was a rope you could adjust airflow for that trap door. And then they also have inmates dig a tunnel to jail in 1932 in order to assist with that airflow. And I really hope that helped. But this is inside the maintenance shaft. By 1960, the fire marshal decided our jail was kind of dangerous. It was getting stuck. It was having difficulty rotating. So they had us stop the rotation by either cementing or cinder blocking the mechanism completely shut. So you can see kind of in that middle photo, there's some bricks down there. Somebody dropped a camera down there and we hope to go properly down the maintenance shaft later, but our plans were pushed off a little bit this last year. I can't imagine why. But the jail would be in use for another 9 years with a smaller capacity after it no longer can rotate. Now you can also see the inside of the ventilation holes in this photo. So it's going to be the one in the middle on the left. Now, where would this be located within the jail? Oh, in the jailer's apartment. So that little alcove area is exactly in the middle of your apartment. The jailer and family did live up there. There were originally 2 bedrooms and a living room and 4 corner rooms. One bedroom was remodeled in the 1930s. They finally have a bathroom on the 4th floor where they're living. Before that, they would be going down 4 floors to the outhouse. So they're pretty big rooms, and they all have gorgeous windows up there. The staff, there have been quite a few jailers over the years. Unfortunately, we don't have a full list yet because the sheriff's position is elected, and so oftentimes they would get rid of many of the pieces of paperwork that we need to know who is working there. And we're working on getting more of the photos as well. The earlier ones can be a little dicey, but one of the jailers, Bill Foster, he's the middle photo, was here for many years, and he was a pretty small man and was able to rotate the 90,000-pound structure on his own. When it was in perfect balance, it moved easily. They say even a child could move it. Now, Jailer Foster had some difficult days as he was jumped by 4 men during an escape, and that's not an unusual occurrence, unfortunately. Now, our last staffers were the Poors. They're going to be on the bottom left. Mrs. Poor was still cooking for all of the inmates up until 1969 at the end. And for one holiday meal, she asked the inmates that were there what they would like, and they asked for spaghetti, which happily is easy to make in giant batches. Now, inmates who have come back and visited us, because we did close so shortly ago, have said the food was good and the treatment was fair, which is wonderful to hear. We know the conditions were a little rough. Now, I mentioned that Jailer Foster was jumped. This jail was meant to be escape-proof, and that was a fantastic idea. But we've had a number of escapes over the years, but it was worse in the last 9 years when inmates could no longer be locked in their cells. And they were free to roam that entire floor. 2 inmates ended up prying up the base of their toilet in the cell and were able to climb out through the plumbing system, which was about 15 feet of plumbing and sewage that they were going through. So they were very committed. Some went out through the roof. A gentleman jumped headfirst out through the window in the booking office. We had 11 go out through the front door once, and we caught all but 3. So the newspapers say 11 escaped, we say 3. We got them all back. That's what counts, right? Now, many want to know our more famous, or in this case, infamous inmates, and that is going to be Jake Bird. He was arrested in 1928 for the attempted murder of a husband and wife in the Carter Lake area. He spent his trial time at the Squirrel Cage and was sentenced to about 30 years at Fort Madison. But he was able to get out after about 12 due to his good behavior. He was able to get work on the railroad and moved across the country with ease. And then he's picked up in Washington State for the murder of a mother and daughter in 1947. He was very easily connected to the crime, was taken to court, found guilty, and sentenced to execution. In order to get a stay of execution, he admits to 44 additional axe murders. So he connects himself to 46. The courts can connect him to about 10 or so just because of this time period, but the knowledge he has makes him the prime suspect in numerous others. Now, Bird also tells everyone involved with his punishment that they will die before his execution. 6 die in that coming time, and that becomes known as the Jake Bird Hex. Now, he's finally executed in 1949. So he's one of our specific inmates, but one of our overcrowding years is going to be 1932 during the farmers' riots. So this is during the Depression. Farmers in the area have stopped selling in order to get better prices to actually support their families. Well, farmers further out start crossing those picket lines. And so the local farmers start pushing those trucks off the road and laying spikes. Unfortunately, this is illegal. So Sheriff Percy Laneson ends up arresting quite a few. With the population we already had in the cage, we end up with about 160 to 165 men in that cage with a 60 inmate capacity. So there are 5 to 6 eating and sleeping in shifts per cell. We do believe this is probably the most overcapacity the jail has ever been, but it was quite full in there. Now, I've mentioned a few times the jail had to stop rotating and the fire marshal thought it was dangerous. Well, it was getting stuck. So you can see on the left, that is a model of the jail and all 3 of those levels rotating. Well, if anything is out of balance, it's gonna get a little stuck. Those gears need to be in perfect alignment. So if you have 5 heavier guys on one side and only 2 skinny guys on the other, that's gonna mess with the gears. And buildings shift, especially metal buildings are gonna expand and contract. So it's at least an inch, if not more, out of alignment. And that's kind of dangerous because that means we can't get to the inmates if there's any emergencies or fires, or if you need to get them out quickly, it's an 8 to 12-minute rotation, just the rotation, not trying to get everyone out. So that's why he ordered us to stop rotating, which means they cut openings all the way around the first floor into the cells. So we have 10 cells to access. And then on the 2 upper floors, there are 5 cells each on the front. Now that means there's no way to lock an inmate in the cell. So it's a free-for-all for those last 9 years, making it dangerous in different ways. Which means it's really time to close the squirrel cage. After being condemned 22 times in our 84 years of use, not too bad, I think, the inmates walk out of the jail in December of 1969, and there are plans being made for a new jail. Inmates from the squirrel cage were transferred to other facilities. Now, the Historical Society knew this building was important, so they worked very hard to clean it and fundraise to set up the museum we see today. They cleaned, painted, fixed the brick, fixed the windows. It was a little dirty in there after all those inmates. And in these pictures, you can see the love that they put into this labor. They worked very hard for us to be able to walk the halls today. And I invite you all to come down and walk those very same halls full of stories and learn a little bit more about the hundreds, if not thousands, of people who have been through our halls. And I know Dr. Warner was here yesterday, and he actually is the host of our podcast, Accidentally Historic, where you can learn more about the jail and more about fun stories in the county. And I don't know if there's time for a question or two. Nope. Perfect. Then thank you, guys.